Yep, thanks. So, welcome to this session this afternoon. My name's Lillian Mason. I'm the convener for Unison Scotland, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this session this afternoon. A couple of things just by way of housekeeping before we go into the session. You'll all be very familiar with the IT platforms that we've been using over the last 20 months, but can I ask you just to remind yourselves to remain on mute if you're not making a contribution. It really does help with the sound quality. And if you do want to come in and speak following the speakers themselves, then if you could indicate by raising your hand on the function that's available for that, or if not, ask me just to draw you in through the chat box. If you want to put questions in the chat system, then do that, and I'll try and pick those out and ask the panel for you. But if you do want to make a contribution or ask a question, then hopefully we can allow that to happen. So for this session this afternoon, hopefully you will have had sight of the report, which we are hopefully going to discuss this afternoon, and that is the Greening Public Services Report, the Unison Report, Getting to Net Zero in the UK Public Services, the Road to Decarbonisation. We've got some excellent speakers for you this afternoon. We launched our report earlier today, and some of the speakers that we'll hear from today were at that launch event itself. Some made a contribution and others were helping in terms of support of that. So for today's, this evening's session, we've got with us Alison Roach from Unison, Paul Novak from the PUC, the Deputy General Secretary of the PUC, David Boyes, the Deputy General Secretary of PSI, Jackson Cullinan from North Ayrshire Council. So I'll ask the speakers to make their contributions, and then we will get through those contributions and we'll hopefully get the opportunity to have that discussion. Just by way of some introduction to the report, helpful, I think, for me just to set some of the scene before I ask colleagues to participate in the discussion. So in terms of Unison and our contributions to this hugely important agenda, we do have a very proud policy and campaigning record over a long time for the decarbonisation and climate action of public services. We've also, and we continue to work very closely and in solidarity with our Global Trade Union Federation in recognition that the North is responsible for 80% of historic carbon emissions, and that the burden to pay for the cost of a climate solution must not fall unfairly on the global South for the climate change. I think for us, we want to make sure that we, as those nations that made a significant contribution to where we are, support and help others who in the South that don't have that opportunity. So I think for me, the report that you're about to hear about, the report that hopefully you've had a chance to get sight of, is for me groundbreaking. It is something, and I think as a trade union, Unison, we have set the bar very high for other trade unions to follow in terms of the research within the report. So without any further ado from me, I am going to ask our panel just to make the contribution, and we will hopefully get that opportunity to hear from others on the call. So can I ask Paul Novak, the Deputy General Secretary of the TUC. Paul, we've not got a running order, but I'm going to ask you to come in, unless Alison, if you want maybe just to set a bit more.
Te invito a ti, a pesar de que Alison quiere decir algo.
Very well rehearsed. So we don't know who's going first, but I'm going to leave it to Alison just to decide.
Yeah, Lillian, I've actually got the presentation from this morning, which I think would be useful for the panel and audience here. So I'm quite happy to run through that and share my screen, and then Paul and David and Joe can contribute afterwards.
Excellent, thank you very much.
The way they'd like, yeah. So I'm going to share my screen now, if that's okay.
We're good. It's working.
Alison, you're on mute, so we can't hear you. Sorry, Alison, if you're speaking, we can't hear you still.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, great. I think the controls might have muted me or something there. I'm not sure. So, can you now see? Okay, I've lost now what I'm supposed to be doing in my presentation. So let's go. I'm going to stop
So
sharing.
we're still on the first slide. We're still on the first slide, Alison, and we could see and hear you.
Okay, great.
It's muted again.
Can you hear me now?
We can just hear you now, Alison. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, and now you can see the screen, yeah, the presentation.
Yes. Brilliant.
Okay, it seems to mute me at some stage, but we've done it. Yeah, so now I'll start. Thank you. Yes, just to say that we commissioned a report this year to look at really where we are in public services. We wanted to get a sense of where we need to go to, but to get that sense of where we need to go to get to net zero by 2050, we needed a baseline, if you like, you know, a starting point. We're not saying that nothing's happened up to COP26 in public services, because obviously things are going on in public services. But we wanted to really get a snapshot of where we are now, what we need to do between now and 2050, and essentially how much is it going to cost to decarbonise public services. So what we did was decide that we would look at key sectors of public services, which more or less Unison represents in our trade union. And that's our health and social care, which includes residential care and obviously non-residential care, which most people know as home care. Local government, which is one of the biggest of our service groups, and obviously one of the biggest public service delivery alongside health. Education, police and justice, and you're looking at probation and courts, and also all the social housing and housing associations that we have in the United Kingdom, which are either community, charity, or socially owned. And look at the water in terms of the provision and water utilities. Water is still public in Wales and Scotland, but not in England, and Ireland also it's still public, sorry, so it's just England that's private. And then when it says environment, we're looking here mainly at the Environment Agency, where Unison has members, and obviously that's to do with the big flood prevention budget that we need when it comes to looking at how we adapt and prevent the negative impacts of climate change. We then didn't want to look at everything. We can't do an all singing and dancing report. It's too much. And what we decided to do then, using essentially the government's own climate committee budget reports and what they're saying needs to be done, we basically drill down to 5 key things. Buildings, i.e. how we're going to decarbonise them and get energy efficiency. Electricity generation, in terms of how we're going to move away from gas and we move to hydrogen, if you like, and electric buildings. Transport, greening transport, looking at how public service workers use their own transport to get to work, to actually deliver services. What do we need to do to green the use of transport for workers? Land use, waste, and public procurement, because supply chain of goods and services is actually 25% of the whole decarbonisation budget that we need to address. And what we found from that modelling was, first of all, that there's no point looking at 2050, even though that's the target set by the UK government, because if we don't do anything between now, 2021 and 2035, you're not even going to get anywhere near what you need to do. So we have to front now what we need to do by 2035 to even have a realistic chance of meeting the targets in 2050. We said it's going to cost £140 billion. And what we've said is that every year there'll still be an operational expenditure of £1 billion a year to make sure we get to net zero 2050. Basically, we'd be looking at £140 billion of the government money. We haven't said how that should be raised. There are lots of different ways we can raise that money. But as a trade union of public services, obviously, we believe that public services should be delivered public, and we're not in favour of privatisation or PFI schemes to fund the decarbonisation needed. So what we've said, actually, it would work out cheaper and beneficial for everybody if, as a minimum of that 140 billion, 122 of that capital investment needed must come from central government. There are other means to raise money. For example, there's a UK infrastructure bank that's been set up. Local governments can get loans, and the government itself can provide schemes as well. But essentially, that is the minimum amount the government will need to provide. We then looked at what the government is doing now, and essentially between now and 25, the next 4 years, £8.2 billion has been promised. Now, if I said we were looking at a minimum of 122 billion, and we take away the 8.2 at the moment, that still leaves a gap of 113 billion. If we were generous and said the government carries on funding at the rate it is now, then what we'd be looking at still would be a gap of 90 billion. So it's still a lot of money we've got to find between now and 2035. We then said that the reason why we need to start now is that the Carbon Budget and the Climate Change Committee in Parliament say the easiest things have to really be decarbonised now, and the harder things like aviation and shipping have to be done after 2035. So they're basically giving a green light to the government to say you need to start decarbonising now because you're a lot easier to do than other sectors. So that's why we're saying not only do we need to start now, but if we do invest now and put in that capital investment, by 2030, we will begin to see the returns, cheaper energy bills, lower procurement costs, and basically in the long term, savings in other measures. So in 9 years, we will get payback. So that's really what we want the government to also look at. We've also said that there will be jobs, particularly locally. If we look at retrofitting, never mind private housing, where 85% of UK housing has to be retrofitted. If we looked just at public buildings, hospitals, courts, etc., or the housing association, council housing, then we think we would provide at least 240,000 jobs over the next 15 years. If there was a speeding up and upfronting of the capital investment to begin to do that retrofitting quicker, then obviously there'll be the same amount of jobs, but it would be in a shorter period of time. On that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back, and then just say to you, we also had recommendations in the report, and what we've said is that one thing missing from public services, which are going to be central to decarbonisation and to get to net zero, is the government has not engaged trade unions. There's no social partnership, and we need social partnership. Workers have to be part of this transformation in the same way we argue that service users do as part of civil society. The government at the moment is hoping that they can leave all this to the private market. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that the private market is not delivering. They're not interested in basically investing in the decarbonisation of public services. So we've got to involve both workers, service users and trade unions because we really are interested in it. The NHS recently produced a survey to show the public are really keen to green our care and health services. So that's why we have got to be part of this transition. We've also said, and I'll just leave this, Lillian, that we've got 400 green reps and activists in Unison across the UK who are ready to engage with employers on what they need to do locally, what they can do, how they can work together to basically deliver green public services. And that's a resource that the government and employers need to use to help them as well. And last but not least, it's not just about greening public services. A lot of public services are beginning to look at how they can use digital and AI tools to basically say that we can cut carbon by this. But that actually could risk public service jobs. And the reason why we want the just transition is because nobody wants to stop the future digitalisation and AI use in public services, but it has to be done with what we would call technology agreements and green agreements so that we're skilling and reskilling those workers who may be at risk of loss of jobs, but we can also identify new jobs from any displacement from data AI, which is used as part of greening public services. So that's just a few things there, and I can talk a bit more, Lillian, later, or ask any questions, and I'll mute myself now. Thank you.
Alison, thanks very much for that contribution, and absolutely taking us through that report was fantastic. Looking at the level of detail that the researchers went into and the findings that they came up with in terms of those recommendations, it is for me a groundbreaking report. But as you say, it will take the trade union and labour movement to advance this agenda, and for us to take it out to our members, and indeed take it to governments. I'm going to move us on, colleagues, to the next speaker that we have this evening, and I'm going to ask Paul Novak, who's the Deputy General Secretary of the TUC. And when I'm asking Paul to make his contribution, perhaps, Paul, I could ask you to focus in and around on the negotiations that the TUC and STUC need to take forward for a just transition. And perhaps in your contribution, you could inform us about the TUC's work that the TUC are doing in terms of direct negotiation with the UK government around decarbonisation agenda. So I'll hand over to you now, Paul. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Lily, and thanks for the opportunity to say a few words, and thanks to the Just Transition Hub for organising this afternoon's event. Two apologies up front. First of all, if you were at the Unison launch earlier, you would have heard some or all of what I'm about to say, but hopefully enough colleagues are on the line. Second thing is I have got informs me I've got an unstable internet connection, so if I go off suddenly, Lillian, you know what. Okay, so let me just talk about, first taking people through the headlines. I think it's a really important report that puts of our discussions about how we get to net zero and how we do our economy. That's important because all too often, I've just done an event about, focused on the lessons from the Lucas plan. And quite often when we talk about just transition, we think about wind turbines, we think about electric cars and gigafactories, we think about how we decarbonise carbon intensive industries. That's all important, but we also need to think about how we decarbonise our public services. I think as the report identifies, just under % of our greenhouse gas emissions are but we know as well that a smarter, greener, better funded public sector will be absolutely essential in us being able to drive decarbonisation right across the economy. And it doesn't matter whether it's further education and the important role that local colleges need to play in terms of reskilling people throughout their working lives, or indeed it's about local governments bringing together the public, private and third sector in localities. Organisation locally, public services are going to be absolutely. So I will, as you suggested, Lillian, focus my remarks on the work that the TUC has been doing nationally to try and influence the UK governments alongside our unions on some of these issues. Before I do, though, I think it is worth reflecting, and I know there's a section in the report on devolution. A huge amount of work has been done by the nations and regions on this agenda, by unions and union centres. I mean, colleagues will know the contribution that the STUC have made through Ros Foyer and Dave Moxham on the Just Transition Commission, particularly STUC. Shav Taj has been working with the Welsh Government about green reps. Right, and there's a whole range of work across the English regions, which I won't go into. The TUC produced a report earlier this year called Voice and Place, which talks about some of those examples. So hopefully people will be able to see that. Nationally as well, I mean, our unions have done a lot of work to try and really how do we make this tangible and real. We've made the case for a balanced green energy mix, and we have, as I said, tried to influence the UK government. And at the end of last year, beginning of this year, I was asked to join the government's Green Jobs Task Force, which brought together unions, employers, education providers.
La plateforme gouvernementale sur les emplois verts.
Pensar en qué podríamos hacer para apoyar a
in the comments later, Lillian, to that report published in the middle of July. Government has yet to pick up all the recommendations in the report. I think they should. But what is very clear is that the big overlap between that report and the report that Unison has produced today. So just to give you 3 examples, I mean, one is you know, I think fundamental. Alison's talked about this. We need to see a step change in the level of investment that the UK government is putting into decarbonisation if we're going to move from net zero rhetoric to net zero reality. The Biden administration is planning to spend £3,000 per head of population over the next decade to decarbonise the US economy. At the moment, Boris Johnson's on course to spend £180 per head to green our economy. So there's a big mismatch. So the £122 billion over the next 15 years. The Green Jobs Task Force called for targeted investment, particularly in those sectors with green jobs potential, to bring us at least in line with the G7 average. We're currently second from bottom of the G7 league table in terms of green investments. The TUC's argued for £85 billion package over 2 years to kickstart the green economy. All of those calls obviously slightly different and over slightly different timescales, but I think they all point to the need for real ambition and real investment from the UK government. So not enough to publish 10-point plans, shows them 10-point plans, I think would be our first message. Second common call is the recognition that government doesn't have all the answers, and there is a value in government bringing together unions, employers, the public sector, education providers, in that, if you like, social partnership approach to really through how we decarbonise our economy. So Unison, in your report, called for a Just Transition Commission for the public sector. The Green Jobs Task Force called for a UK-wide body to oversee workforce transition. TUC has got a long-standing call for a National Just Transition Commission backed by local and regional commissions. But that's really important if we're going to keep the government honest on this process, and if we're going to hold them to account on this process, particularly how taxpayer money is spent, that investment is used. And that really brings me to my third point where there's an overlap, Lillian, which is, and I think critical from a union perspective, I want to make sure that every single pound of taxpayers' money that's spent on the just transition, on moving us towards net zero, is spent not only on helping us achieve our climate goals, but is spent on supporting the creation and the protection of good quality employment in both the public and the private sector. And the sad fact is, at the moment, not every green job is a good job, and we need good union jobs. We need to be thinking about how we use framework agreements to support those good quality jobs, how we keep out private sector providers that have blacklisted trade unions, refuse to engage with trade unions, how we use public procurement in a much more positive way. We deliver a lot of this directly in the public sector. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But that was certainly, again, a recommendation from the Green Jobs Task Force, is that the government should be required to say how they're going to make sure that their green job strategy actually delivers good quality jobs, rather than just piling up lots of insecure, low-paid employment. Maybe fourth point, which Alison touched on, and is not common to the Green Jobs Task Force, but certainly is common to the work that we've been doing at the TUC. I think the report really does reinforce the need for us to revitalise and reinvigorate the arguments for public ownership and different models of public ownership and governance of our public services, whether that's in water, whether it's in our railways, a combination of perfect storm of things around the pandemic, the need for us to decarbonise, the digital revolution that Alison talked about, I think gives us the opportunity to think again about how we deliver some of those core public services in a way that puts public benefits at the forefront rather than private profit. Now, look at the report. It's not going to be easy to convince a Conservative government to put up £122 billion by any stretch of the imagination. You have to look at the budget last week. Rishi Sunak had nothing to say at all about the green economy in the budget. But I would just finish on this point that, I think actually with the collective weight of unison, the collective of the trade union movement, alongside others, there has never been a more important or probably more timely sort of moment in time for us to actually not only win the public arguments, but actually begin to shift governments, shift employers, and make that just transition to net zero. So I'll leave it there, Lillian, and look forward to taking part in the discussion. Only caveat is I've got to go and get a train at R5, so I might have to go.
No worries. Thanks very much, Paul. And your contribution was very, very welcome this morning in terms of the launch of the report. And I think today, this evening, equally very welcome. I think for me, one of the parts that the catalyst, as it were, in terms of us doing the piece of research and launching the report was around exactly as you described, the net zero rhetoric and the need to move to a net zero reality. And that hopefully this report will be that catalyst that moves governments across the world to that reality. But thank you very much for your contribution. And absolutely, if you need to go, we understand that without a doubt. Can I take us to our next speaker and invite David Boyes to make his contribution. David is the Deputy General Secretary of PSI. David, significant members of PSI in the Global South will increasingly be impacted on by climate change more than in the North, and we know that. And when we read through our report, we recognise that we hear a lot of talk about climate resilience, defined as the ability to survive, to adapt, and to sustain improved livelihoods, no matter what kinds of climate stress or shock we're experiencing. How are PSI workers negotiating a fair and just climate emergency response? And are governments actually listening to their just transition demands? Thanks, David.
Thank you, Lillian. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So, look, PSI is a global trade union federation, as you said, representing 30 million working women and men across a range of public services. And in speaking about the Global South, but not only, we're looking at a whole bunch of connected crises, whether it's climate, whether it's inequality, it's the health crisis, as we're seeing with the pandemic and the TRIPS waiver, the energy crisis, where 800 million don't have access to modern energy, biodiversity loss, loss of jobs, public service austerity. These are all connected. And there are many, many challenges in front of us. But let me just say that I think this is a unique moment for us to build bridges, to build networks, to move our policies into a more progressive arena. And it's clear, I think, for all unions that we in the labor movement need to do more education with the workers. We need to unpack and then reconnect these challenges and how we confront them. We need to network more among different unions, but also, and importantly, out in community groups where our members live. And then finally, I think we really are going to have to mobilize. Look, let me say that the UN agreed in 2015 the Sustainable Development Goals, which are quite ambitious, which, for example, have universal access to health, to water, to education, to energy. And most of these involve local and regional governments, national governments. They really are a public sector focus. But the UN and the World Bank and IMF continue to focus on this innovative finance approach, whereby public funds are used to attract private capital, where we use taxpayer money to de-risk, in other words, public subsidies to private profits. And this has been going on for a while. And let me just say, the best analysis we have today is that it is not working. The private sector is not investing where we need them. They are investing where there's profits. And even when they invest in profitable areas, you get big screw-ups like Carillion. You get big problems with any public services managed for profit. And so as we try to deal with issues in the South, we have to address global governance, because so many of the policies that are either imposed or adopted in the South are set by countries in the North, including, for example, on the board of the IMF and World Bank, which have tons of influence in the global South, using their money to impose conditionalities, to impose austerity, to cut public service wages, and to force privatizations. So these institutions, which are public institutions, and the main governments on their boards include the USA, the UK, Japan, Germany, the EU. They're the ones setting these conditions, even though, for example, in the UK, I think people are about fed up with PFI and all of the privatization. And I think there's enough disasters. But the Adam Smith Institute, for example, will not hear any of that and continues to advise. So, the unions in the South, they see these policies coming to their government. Their governments adopt them because they need the funds, whether in loans or in grants. And so they have to adopt them. But this advice from these institutions also includes advice on how to destroy public sector unions. So it's quite impressive. We got to also look at the free trade deals, which are about protecting investors more than eliminating tariffs on the movements of goods, and which really does set in a post-colonial dynamic. So the key concerns for, I think, all public service unions and public service workers and heads of family is universal access to quality public services. And we've got a really different range of access and of quality, of reliability across the world. So in countries where there is infrastructure, there are services available to the public, managed by the public. The key issues for the unions are, one, keep the privateers and the financial vultures away. We don't want BlackRock there. We don't want Carillion there. So keep them away. Then we have to build out these services typically to make sure that that they really are universally accessible. And there's a big issue about maintaining services. It takes a lot of skilled workers, of committed workers with training and tool to maintain what is there. And that, of course, passes through decent working conditions so that people can work with dignity and safety. in countries without access to the public infrastructure, clearly we need to find money to build it. We need to develop the skills to build it. We need to build real green. So for example, renewable energy is entirely appropriate for countries with low access to networked electricity systems, so that we can jump over the fossil fuel technology and go directly to renewables. But that's not what the private sector is doing. And where services have been privatized, many unions are joining the push to move them back and bring them back in-house, bring them back into public hands. It's also happening with outsourced workers. They're being brought back in-house for a range of reasons, notably better teamwork. Let me just mention a couple of other issues. One of the big concerns in the South is the amount of migration caused by the climate crisis. And so these are either refugees that stay within their borders but move within the country, or they're refugees that move outside. And you'd think from the noise in Europe that they're all coming to Europe, but 85% of refugees are hosted by developing countries. And so it's clear that the public sector has to be able to receive them, to protect their human rights, to integrate them in the job market, to ensure that they're not abused, and to provide them the essential sustenance for life. So, look, we're fighting against privatization, because once you privatize, it's really hard to green, it's really hard to get universal access. So that's one of the things. But we're also training our members across the world on tax justice and public country by country reporting by multinationals to ensure there's better financing. We're also training our members on why we have to push back against the current trade regimes, getting rid of the investor-state dispute settlement systems, getting rid of the Energy Charter Treaty, and fighting against austerity policies, both at global and regional levels. So, and then finally, because all of these affect the ability to finance public services, we are joining the debt relief campaigns, and we're training our members on why they should talk about debt. In many countries, governments spend 4 times more on servicing debt than they are on climate financing, and a lot of this is odious debt from previous generation done during the Cold War. So Lily, we've really got a lot of stuff going on. There's a couple of specifics I can talk about that unions are doing, but let me just say, fighting for decent staffing and working conditions is core business, but we also need the tools to ensure universal access to quality public services. Thanks.
David, thanks very much for your contribution. Greatly received. I can see lots of hands up in terms of that contribution. I think it's absolutely right that we move the agenda and we start to talk about the things that matter to us on a global scale, and around PFI, around privatisation and bringing services back in-house, I think is absolutely crucial to that. But talking about global debt, managing managing that expectation as well in terms of what we can contribute to, and training and upskilling workers in their communities, again, crucial. Colleagues, I'm going to move us on to our next contribution, and we've got a speaker from North Ayrshire Council, Joe Cullinan. Joe, you're very welcome to join us this afternoon. Thank you very much for giving up your time to join us. And perhaps making some of the contributions, I'm going to pose a couple of questions, Joe, if you're okay with that. And I think with the level of expertise that you have in terms of leader of the council, but also the cabinet lead for community wealth building, important that we hear what we can do practically on the ground in relation to this. So what are the solutions that you've been advancing within North Ayrshire for local government services, and what else do we need to do to green our public services? And in particular, what can we do locally as public sector workers in order to advance this hugely important agenda? Thanks very much, Joe. You're very welcome.
Well, thank you, Lillian, and thank you very much for inviting me along. I've managed to download the report that was launched earlier on, and I've had a wee flick through it, and I think it does look like a really good report, and I'm looking forward to delving into it a wee bit more when I get the chance. I think as the report, as I've seen so far, in what Paul was saying earlier on, kind of highlights maybe the first thing for me to say, and that is that in terms of North Ayrshire as an area, the council only emits a fraction of the carbon emissions that we see across the wider North Ayrshire region. So the council itself is never going to solve the climate emergency by just taking actions which sort of decarbonise the council, if you like. We've certainly been in that field for a number of years, though. We've cut our carbon emissions by close to 50% over the last few years. But I think the bigger challenge is obviously to make North Ayrshire a net zero region, and we've set that target for 2030. How we pretty simple, really sort of initiatives, if you like, such as transitioning to LED lighting. Council's carpool scheme open to employees has cut down sort of business travel, etc. We have been investing in our sort of non-domestic council buildings as well in terms of decarbonisation. So we have installed solar panels, alternative heating sources, etc. into some of our buildings, and that all obviously reduces our carbon emissions. Also get current initiatives that we've started to fund, like a big tree planting programme. So we're going to be planting 108,000 new trees across North Ayrshire, and that obviously will offset some of your carbon emissions. Not as good as reducing your carbon emissions, obviously, but it is offsetting it. And also put in some sort of seed funding to accelerate the transition to our electric vehicle fleet for the council as well. So when you take all of that sort of initiatives and investments that we're making, I can see a path to becoming a net zero council quite easily, and that is with us funding that as a local authority. I know the report makes quite a significant ask of government in terms of capital investment to decarbonise the public sector, and I think that's a really important ask, and I think it's one that we should all support, but certainly be making investments ourselves. We can achieve the net zero council, if you like, over the next few years, I believe. The bigger challenge is obviously decarbonising the wider economy. It's shown that leadership to achieve net zero as a region, and that's obviously going to involve investments in private buildings. It's going to have to look at transport systems in the local area. It's going to have to look at the business space and how many emissions they're emitting themselves, and that is the bigger challenge. I think the report itself is right in saying that private finance is going to be inadequate in terms of tackling that. We cannot leave this to Jeff Bezos giving us a few crumbs off his table like he did last week. Certainly can't rely on capitalism as an economic system to bail us out of the crisis that they have at the end of the day created. But I think the other thing is that private ownership's not going to be adequate either. We're going to have to transition, I think, to public ownership and common ownership and see that as the sort of preference for how we build the local economy going forward. So that brings me on to Lily and what you had said there around community wealth building. I think that the first thing I would say about community wealth building is that ownership runs throughout what we are trying to do with community wealth building in North Ayrshire Council. It's certainly not an approach to look at outsourcing contracts, and in fact, we've got a solid record, an increasing record in looking at insourcing contracts. 80% of our care at home contracts are now in-house, and we certainly won't sit back and see that as tick box, we've done 80%. We will certainly be looking at that other 20% as contracts come up for renewal. And one of the most progressive and inclusive forms of ownership, I believe, and I think studies have shown to be the case, is municipal ownership. Municipal ownership of not just public services, but the wider economy as well through municipal enterprise. And if you look at carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland, for example, transport accounts for about 37% of Scotland's emissions. 69% of that is road transport. And that is because we have a really poor public transport system in this country. I mean, I know delegates to COP are enjoying travel passes, etc., to do sort of interconnected public transport modes of travel in Glasgow City Council. Once they go home next week, Glaswegians and other Scots will not be able to take advantage of some of that because we have no proper infrastructure in place. And I think that means that what we really need to see in terms of transport and public transport is publicly owned, publicly run, affordable public transport for our residents to actually ditch the car, to leave the car at home and actually make the sustainable green choice to use a good public transport network. So in terms of community wealth building, we are absolutely intent, and our ambition is been set out in this regard, to run municipal bus services, to have them owned by the council, to remove the profit motive from bus services, and for us to actually meet and run a council bus service which meets the needs of our local residents in our communities. I think there is an opportunity in certainly the Strathclyde, former Strathclyde region, for us to do that across that region, working together through Strathclyde Passenger Transport and using the transport bill that was passed in the Scottish Parliament as the mechanism to achieve that. So very much looking to work with other Labour colleagues in the Strathclyde region to see that set up across that regional area. I think the other area that we need to advance in terms of a Strathclyde region approach is clearly the pension fund, and that will be of interest, obviously, to your members. I mean, I think none of us will be in the place where we wouldn't agree with the fact that the pension fund needs to divest from some of the investments that it's currently got in fossil fuel companies, etc. What I think that the fund also needs to do, and it's linked with community wealth building again, is to provide direct local investment into the regional economy. It's no, I don't think, good enough for the pension fund just to deliver a small pension at the end of a worker's working life. There is opportunities out there to invest in the economy, to create green jobs, to provide opportunity for people across the region, whilst also providing that remuneration at the end of your working life as part of that. So there's not just one way that a pension fund can invest, and it's not just in stocks and shares, and certainly not just in fossil fuel companies. Another strand we are very much focused on in terms of a council and looking at municipal leadership in this area is the establishment of a community bank. It would be a mutually owned bank. It would be owned by its customers. It would be able to use the deposits that they put in the bank to create fresh finance. And because it's owned by the customers, we would be in charge of setting out its investment strategy. And you can again see how a community bank could deliver hundreds of millions of pounds of investment in the green economy and help us create the green jobs that we need to see. And final thing I would say in terms of Strathclyde work and aligned again to municipal enterprise and what we want to achieve with community wealth building is, if the Scottish Government have ditched their plans for a publicly owned energy company, then why don't we just step in and look and explore the opportunity for Strathclyde, for example, to look at a municipally owned energy company, not just a retail energy company selling energy to customers, but let's look at generating energy as well and having that as renewable energy. And that takes me on to what we're doing in renewable energy as a council as well, Lillian. We have set aside money to invest in 2 council-owned solar farms. These solar farms will be situated on our former landfill sites. They will reduce our carbon emissions by 850 tonnes a year. They will provide 2/3 of the council's energy needs going forward. And as well as that, the financial surplus that will be returned to the council is £25 million over the period of the business case for the 2 council-owned solar farms. So it's a really significant investment, a community wealth building investment in North Ayrshire and in the green agenda. We're exploring opportunities in wind power, battery and hydrogen as well. And we find that there's opportunities, not just to supply 100% of the council's energy needs through renewable energy, publicly owned renewable energy at that, but also to look at procurement opportunities with the rest of the public sector. So we're having conversations with the health board, with the fire service, with the police about what is your energy needs, how do you get your energy to your buildings, and can we build up a sort of Ayrshire-wide publicly owned renewable energy network which provides renewable energy direct to the public sector, and I think that would be significant. 13% of Scotland's emissions are from homes. We've got a massive council house building programme, 1,625 new council houses, all energy efficient houses, with new technology and low carbon technology installed. Also got a solar PV retrofit programme in place where tenants' energy bills are being reduced, and we're putting
I think we've lost Joe. Joe, your sound quality's gone, so if you can hear us, then we're not able to hear you. So maybe if you go out and try and reconnect, that'll bring you back in. But I think we absolutely get the value of your contribution was absolutely tremendous in terms of what practically has been done within our local government community in North Ayrshire, not only to support the North Ayrshire constituents and community, but the broader and wider community within Scotland, some of those initiatives that you described, bringing in the whole of the public sector, the whole system to organise and operate in a green economy is a fantastic initiative. And we really do hope that you're able to share a bit more of that if you manage to come back on and connect with us. I'm conscious of time, colleagues, so I'll keep us going. And I'm just going through some of the questions that have been asked. And Paul, I'm conscious that you have a train to catch. So I'm going to probably come to you first to let you leave the meeting, if that's okay. And there's a question from Richard asking about the value of the trade union movement through the TUC entering into discussions with the UK government around the task force for the green jobs, and I'm wondering if it's appropriate for the TUC to enter into such discussions with government, and what value that brings to the wider movement.
Yeah, absolutely, Lillian. Happy to take that. And I haven't seen the question direct, but I'll try and pick it up. Absolutely, we have to. I mean, we have to deal with the government of the day, whether we like it or not. And I don't like the fact that we got a Conservative government in Westminster, and I don't like the fact that they've got an 80-seat majority in Westminster. But that's the government we've got, and it's also, and you know, this is a hard fact for us on this call to have to accept. We know that many of our members would have voted for that Conservative government. Perhaps less in Scotland than in other parts, regions and nations of the UK, but that's the reality. So we've absolutely got a job to engage with the government. And, you know, I've been in meetings with Christina and other unison representatives and representatives of, I suspect, all the unions on the call, with government ministers, everybody from the Chancellor down. And we have to go into those rooms and make those arguments on behalf of our members. Now, I think there's a value beyond that on the Green Jobs Task Force, because what it actually did was brought together not just, you know, us engaging with government, but employers, education providers and others. And I've put a link to that task force recommendations there. There's some pretty radical stuff in terms of those recommendations, you know, reinforcing the call for a Green Jobs Task Force, reinforcing the calls for, you know, UK to up its level of investment in green jobs, calling for creative approaches to supporting people to reskill. So not just making sure courses are available, but making sure they've got the financial support to do it. And I think it's worthwhile doing, us having our voices alongside employers saying, you know, challenging the government to deliver on this sort of stuff. And call government out when they don't do what we want. And anybody who, for example, would have seen our budget response last week, I think we'll see that we're unafraid to call the government out. But 20 months, Lillian, I mean, you know, one of the areas where, for example, we engaged with the government and it had a direct positive impact for working people was the furlough scheme. I mean, at one stage, 12 million people in this country were having their income supported and their jobs kept alive by a scheme we negotiated and our unions directly with the UK Treasury. And if that wouldn't have happened, then we would have seen mass unemployment on a scale that would have, you know, wreaked havoc on our community. So, you know, I would hope that we had a different government, and I hope that we see political change in this country. But the reality is we have to deal with the government of the day. And I say, I don't think that makes us a party. It means that we have to engage where we can, campaign hard against them and maintain our independence beyond that.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you for that response. I think absolutely right that we do that we need, where the opportunity takes us, and have those conversations direct with the government in power is, for me, the right thing to do. Got a couple of questions in the chat, one around divestment in public sector pensions and local government pensions, around divestment in fossil fuel. I don't know, Alison, if you want to pick that up. The question around that is, what do we need to do and how can we best take that forward? I know there are significant challenges. I know there are areas that we're already campaigning on in terms of our National Delegate Conference. We've had a number of motions that have gone to conference, and to look at how we advance our policy objectives around that. Alison, do you want just to respond to that point? And Joe, thank you for your contribution. I should have said when you came back on, we did move on. I know you were coming to an end in your contribution, but it was hugely welcome. Thank you. Alison.
Yes, thanks, Lillian, and thanks everyone for their contributions, and particularly Joe. I've written loads of notes of your great work you're doing. It's really inspiring, I have to say, and the way that also you've got a vision to integrate, regionally and not just be in your silo is something that we also want to encourage, coming from our report. I have to say, Lillian, that I don't actually work on divestment because we actually have two officers in Unison. Because it's seen as such a responsible area of work and you have to have a certain level of expertise of pensions, I often defer all the divestment and pensions. So I don't know if maybe Joe wants to pick that up because he might have more experience on hand, except that we do support it in principle, but obviously the fiduciary responsibilities are what are the key concerns, and how do we move the investment so we don't lose the value. We know our members have worked hard all their lives. We would certainly never want to put at risk, their retirement well earned. So I don't know if Joe can say a bit more on that. Thank you.
Do you want me to come in, Lillian? Yeah, no, thanks, Alison. In terms of local pension funds, I think the first thing is let's divest from fossil fuels. I think everybody agrees with that. As an alternative investment strategy, though, I think there's a lot of work been done in certain states in America. I mean, I think one that springs to mind is the Alabama Pension Fund, which for a number of years has been investing in the local economy, democratic ownership models, created thousands of jobs and made a return to the funds, the fund itself. And if you look at what's happening with community wealth building in other areas in the UK, it kind of kick-started, as people are probably aware, in Preston with the Preston model. And one of the investments that has been made in Preston has been from the pension fund as part of their kind of city deal. The pension fund has invested in, for example, student accommodation. So there was a really derelict part of the city. The building was falling into disrepair. The pension fund has basically bought the building, turned it into student accommodation, and the return to the pension fund is actually from the rents that then the students put in to that. And also there's a proposal there in Preston for a hotel to be owned by the pension fund as well. And what I'm saying to people at Glasgow City Council who obviously manage Strathclyde Pension Fund and also my own officers is let's look at the opportunities around those type of investments. They do create some jobs, but they also return money to the pension fund. So it can't be out with our sort of capabilities to have a different type of investment strategy, because one of the first conversations I had about the community wealth building and pension fund investments was that if you looked at Strathclyde Pension Fund, I bet you the vast majority of the investments are in stocks and shares, and it is 70% is in the financial markets. And some of that will be delivering a return. I mean, I know that they've invested heavily in Amazon, for example, but what is the social return of investing in Amazon is very, very slim, and particularly when you see some of the working conditions that their workers work under, you start to question some of those investments as well. So I think there's an alternative investment sort of strategy that we could be pushing public sector funds to take as they divest from fossil fuels, etc.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Alison. Colleagues, we're beyond the time that we allocated ourselves for this discussion. Can I thank everyone for their questions, and apologies that we've not been able to respond to them directly. But what I'm proposing we do is we ask colleagues, Alison and others on the call, if there are points that folks have asked that you can respond to in very, very short answers, then please do so. David, there was a question or a comment in from your contribution around education, supporting building a movement, building and organising workers to take on those challenges that you described around privatisation. Hugely important, and I think we probably could have gone on a bit longer for today, but I'm really conscious that our time is up. So I'm going to ask our panellists, I know that Paul has had to leave, just very quickly in terms of winding up this session, what they see as we are at COP for the next couple of weeks. So what they see as that would be a positive outcome from those discussions, and how can we in the movement advance our agenda and take forward any of the potential positive outcomes from COP. So I'm going to start with you, David, if that's okay.
Sure. Look, just quickly on the pensions one. One of the biggest pension funds of public service workers in the Netherlands, which manages 540 billion euros, has decided that shareholder activism doesn't work, and they have divested from fossil fuels. Also, New York State public pension fund. So again, these pension funds are for public service workers. They're where the workers actually can sit on the board of trustees. And so that's an important thing that we need to look at. But coming out of COP, I think that we need to engage with our local and regional governments. And I think Joe showed the example, and he's not alone. There's a lot more we can do there, and we need to figure out how to engage in ways that are not just every 4 years going to the polls. We have to get engaged, and I agree that the Preston model of shortening the supply chain, changing public procurement decisions, enabling suppliers, for example, to provide organic meals to schools and hospitals rather than some frozen garbage food made by a multinational. These are all really, really important. My final note on both on pensions and on generally looking at finance, private equity is really, really dangerous, and it's very, very slippery environment. So let's push back against them, but let's support our progressive local and regional governments. Over. Thanks, Lily.
Thanks very much, David. Joe, can I come to you next, please? Just final remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Lillian. I think my kind of final remark is don't hold out too much hope for anything to happen at COP over the last week. I mean, I think the sight of, as I said earlier on, Jeff Bezos last week, and then the Chancellor turning up with a green suitcase, etc., was enough to make you vomit. And I don't think that we're going to find solutions inside that conference hall. So my kind of closing remark would be for everyone to continue organising, and for us to actually, as we take the just transition out to communities, to speak the language of communities. I don't think that it can be seen as just a sort of middle class cause. We need to be speaking the language of working class communities, some of them who probably work in some carbon intensive industries and who are concerned about their jobs, and we need to be speaking the language of them and reassuring them that the agenda that we are pursuing here in terms of climate change and climate action is one which can offer them jobs and hope as well as the planet. So I think that would be my kind of closing remark. Let's organise, but let's keep in mind that we need to be working alongside working class communities and workers.
Thanks very much, Joe. Alison, do you want just to make your final remarks, please?
Yes, I'll be very quick. Last week we had the budget by the Chancellor, and there was no green budget. It's that's stark about how much they're not funding the transition to the green economy. And actually what Ricky Shunak said was that if we do a budget, we're going to basically cut public services to fund it. And we are going to argue very strongly against that. It's quite simple. We want budgets which are operational for good quality public services, and we want a separate budget for decarbonisation and getting public services to net zero. And after today, we will write to the Chancellor, the government, and all the different departments that we've set out to ask them to respond to our report and give us feedback. And then we're going to take it to employers and our branches and reps. And in spring 22, we're going to do an addendum to this report and set out what feedback we got and what engagement we got. And so we're going to keep this discussion alive and put it into actions so that we do get the social dialogue and social partnership that we want. And we know lots of employers will be on board with us to do this. So we look forward to working with them.
Thanks very much, Alison. Colleagues, it leaves for me to thank all of our panellists today for their marvellous contributions, and to thank you for coming on this call. Again, apologies if we didn't manage to get your question through to the panel. This is the start of that journey, as Alison says. We launched a report this morning, this afternoon, in fact, in Unison House in Glasgow, and it's not launching it, shelving it. This is a tangible document that we intend to take out to communities, to employers, to workplaces, and as Joe says, engage directly with our members. And that's what we intend to do. And as a health service worker, I know only too well the challenges right now in our public services and indeed in our health service that we are faced with. But there is no greater challenge or no greater return for the work that we do in terms of the climate emergency. So it's hugely important that we have those conversations. So as a mother, a grandmother, as convener for Unison Scotland, I intend to make this part of the priorities for Unison moving forward. Again, thank you very much. Alison has helpfully put the report, the link to the report in the chat. However, you can also download it from the Unison website. It is a very ambitious report and we think it is achievable. We think it is absolutely groundbreaking. And as we've heard today, there is much work for us to do. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.